Hello and welcome to a Taylor's Tales podcast. This is Chris's Corner. I'm your host, Chris Taylor, and today we are doing something that we've not done before, something interesting. I thought with the current situation of seeing it across social media and a couple of other things going on in the world is that, well, history is something that I've always been interested in. And with the current state of affairs, I think that more than anything else is learning about history other than our own. So in my case, the British history and American history, and so on and so forth. And I thought today I'd go into Russian history, something I studied back at A level, something that will forever, be something that I truly enjoy. And for me personally, I think that it's had a real effect on understanding that bad things have been occurring since day one, and good things occur since day one as well. But Russian history is definitely not a lot of good things, but we'll get into that. So we're going to go with Russian history 1855 to 1917 today. Do an hour of this, see how it goes, see if people are interested. If you're not into history, leave now. The door's there. Get out. What are you doing here still? But for those who are interested, welcome. And we're looking into the fall of the Romanovs, something that I think very, very little is sort of seen in both. From what I've seen, is that there's very little studied at schools at the moment, other than within A level, that focuses on this part of history. I think it's fascinating. I was lucky enough to study this. I think that since I've spoken to people, it's not studied in GCSE. It's not studied in before GCSEs. It's hard to consider that, from year 7 to year 9 in the UK sort of education system, that it's very hard to get something as complex as Russian history across to people. So let's go into 1855 before the main part of the history we're going to cover here. And what was the current state of Russia in 1855? Well, 85% of the population was illiterate, and about a third of the population were still serfs, meaning slaves, basically. It was a nicer term for slaves because they were the people there were tied to the land. So as slaves, they had no rights and they couldn't choose their master. They could only work the land that they'd been born into. So from father to son and so on and so forth, or mother to daughter. And just before 1855, Nicholas I had to deal with military riots, and he was known as the policeman of Europe. And that was the riots I'm talking about, the Decembrist riots. So they're well known. Decembrist riots occurred because of the first revolutionary groups, from what I'm aware, in history in Europe. I shouldn't be saying history. There's probably other revolutionary people. And European liberalism had been rejected. And only in 1851 had the first railroad been introduced, which is kind of crazy, considering that Russia was meant to be a modern European state, and Russia itself at that point was considered by the rest of Europe kind of archaic in terms of economic, agricultural. Yeah, agriculture still dominated as Russia's main way of making money within the economy. Industry wasn't as well introduced because of serfdom. Serfdom still meant that within agriculture, that was their main skills. So the industry required a little new skill set that Russia hadn't adapted to yet. But to give a little bit of context, in 1855, I'm pretty sure that that's the first reign of is it Alexander? I want to say, yeah, Alexander II. And before we get into his period of history, I want to give a little bit of context who the Romanovs are. They're a family, a royal family who descend from sort of, I think, from what I'm aware, the dynasty has existed since 1613, and their first sort of descendant was Mikhail, who wasn't necessarily, he was chosen from, I think, by both the Orthodox Christian Church and also by the people, well, not the people, but the sort of nobles, the royalty. There wasn't a lot of, at that time, I'm pretty sure, I've got a statistic here that the 80% of the population were serfs when Mikhail in 1613 were. So basically 80% of Russia's population was serfdom at that period of time. Only a third of it the 1800s, 1855. These statistics, I could be wrong, by the way, but so if I am, I shall make sure that these statistics are researched. I'll do some editing and point if I'm wrong here. Otherwise, we'll have to continue and go with feelings and not facts. Yeah, so the dynasty lasted 300 years. 300 years. You consider that. It's hard to consider history. I mean, to think of it in, it feels like a lifetime, doesn't it, for most people in lockdown at the moment? But 300 years of a dynasty, and for the majority of that dynasty, well, all of that 300 years, serfdom. You were a slave basically, so there was no way out. Um, that's just madness. But so Mikhail wasn't the first person to. He was 16. Yeah, I've got that written down here. Yeah, 16 years old at the time of ascension, which is, it was common back then to have sort of dynasties and kings and queens who would ascend the throne at the age of like 14, 15, 16. But it was his son, Mikhail's son, Alexei I, who would turn 80% of the population into serfs under the law of, and don't quote me here, Sobonyer Alexikniner. I'm going to try and repeat that. Sobonyer Alexem. Yeah, that's yeah, that's what the law was called for when the serfs were made, and this law again was in place for 200 years from Alexia's ascension all the way until Alexander II's removal, the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. A third of the population between 1598 and 1613. So before Mikhail came to power, there was extreme poverty. There was war going on. Basically, what we call the Eastern Front, but probably the Western Front of Russia, was being completely destroyed by both the Polish sort of war machine at the time. There was a lot of war going on within the Poland area, what we would consider multiple countries now, and there was the Ottoman Empire was getting involved. So Russia was being attacked from multiple fronts at that time. There was dysentery, there was plague. So you've got to think that that third of the population was killed by war, poverty, and plague. And so having a new ruler to come in and basically unify Russia within that period of time was key. Foreign troops occupied Moscow at that time. My God, yeah, I've got that written down here. So Moscow at the time had been created far before this, and it was a very small, and due to the Mongols basically conquering the majority of Russia, the original Serbian, white Russians occupied the smallest part of Russia, which is Moscow, which is livable, but it is their capital, sort of the original Russia. Anyway, and yes, so when this happened in 1613, and Mikhail became the leader, since 2005. The 4th of November is Russian National Unity Day, which I thought was kind of strange, seeing as, something that we forgot the other day. The 5th of November, remember the 5th of November, gunpowder treason and plot. I see no reason for the gunpowder treason to ever be forgot, and yet the entire country did because of this lockdown happening on that day. Ironic that in V for Vendetta, when that happened and people were told to stay inside. So the entire country rioted. And in reality, it was more of a passive whimper. But nonetheless, laws are laws, and it's intriguing to see that even Russia is the day before us for a unity, and the day after is us basically saying this is our king, don't kill him. Very different scenario, but very similar. 1793, during Catherine the Great's reign, she received news of the execution of King Louis the XVI, and this was sort of the first inklings of ideas. So before 1855, what I'm trying to establish here, this period of time, is in 1855 we start to see the cogs moving for the revolution in 1917. But even before that, within Catherine the Great's reign, we start to see within France, a liberal France, that kings and queens are executed, and countries become republics, and countries become just ruled by the people rather than by monarchs. And this isn't the first sort of thing you're going to see in time. And I think it's really important to establish that these sort of executions sort of they're happening before the Communist Party becomes before the Communist Party forms. And so a lot of people nowadays, when we look at communism, we look at the far left, the worst thing that could possibly happen on the far left of liberalism. We say, oh, this has only happened within communism, that the leaders of the country, the aristocratic leaders, are executed and taken away. But truly, it's been happening far before communism. And I'll get into the sort of political aspects as well as in this, because they are thoroughly interesting. But yes, anyway, the point being is that kings and queens were vulnerable during this period of time, and that in Russia, the news of Louis XVI's death was basically the first domino to fall. And then you had in 1812, I know we've skipped quite a bit of time here, but this is just giving like a little bit of an overview before 1855, is that in 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia. And so this liberalism actually attacked Russia very early on in the 19th century. And you've got to think to yourself, when it comes to the 20th century, it's actually liberalism and the far left and socialism that becomes the Soviet Union. And so it's very intriguing to see that there's this sort of forgetfulness in human beings where we forget that, oh, we were attacked by that yesterday, but today it's our friend and not and not our enemy. Yes. Anyway, back to the state of things in 1855. So that's giving you an overview that before 1855 there were little things that were happening within the empire that were leading to the fall of the Romanovs. And we're seeing these little things like making 80% of the population serfs, like the December riots, the Decembrist riots, the 1793 execution, these little things that are being fed to the population. These ideas, even if they are illiterate, you can still be influenced. And you've got to remember as well, during these periods of time, there's no internet, there's no anything like that. There's barely messengers. There's barely, people can barely, as I've said, they can't read and write. So the communication is purely by word of mouth. So it's much harder to get across ideas that are quite complex, like political swaying and the economy and the organization of governments and kings and queens. And it's very, I think I read in a Terry Pratchett book that in Guards, one of the recent books that I read, that the leader of the city within the Guards book said that people aren't necessarily good. They're more like a low sort of murmur of bad. That the mob only becomes an issue not when one voice is heard, but when many are united. And that message isn't a message of positivity but negativity, and it's easy, and it becomes the mob blaming a group of people. And we'll get into group identity politics along the way here, because it's very interesting to see that this isn't just a 20th century idea. This has been around far before then, far before this time. But people do think that in today's society that it's, let's place them in a group, that'll make things better, well, isn't that nice? Yes. So, yeah. So you had Herzl, the father of liberalism, as he was called back then. I say that as a very loose term, who migrated from Russia to London and wrote about how how sort of easy it could be. Not easy, but volatile. Russia was volatile for that ability to have liberalism implemented within there. But a lot of these sort of literaries, I want to say literaries, who can't necessarily get their ideas across, come to London, and that's why Marx and multiple other people moved to the UK at the time, because it was a place of ideas at the time, because you had the massive technological and industrial revolution going on with many new things going on. And yes, 1855, a point here that's extremely important that I haven't mentioned yet is of course, the horrible, humiliating treaty that Russia had to sign with Britain and France and the Ottoman Empire for the Crimean War that they just lost. They lost it. At that point previously, Russia had been basically expanding south consistently. And they'd been expanding their empire more and more, and Russia was gaining greater. But the Ottoman Empire at the time was slightly, I think, a historian I heard, and I might misquote them here, called them like a sick child. Ottoman Empire was slowly crumbling. It was once great, and by the time that Russia was expanding, it was slowly deteriorating. So we've got to this point. We've seen Russia. Russia's in a state of, well, it's still quite an archaic country for the 19th century. And so we've got Alexander II, who comes in to take over from his father. And he's going to basically try and reform the country in some way or another. And he is called the liberator. And that term, I remember when I first studied this, when I first read it, I was like, oh, Alexander II, he's such a liberator. He's great. He's fantastic. He's done all these great things. And as we're getting on to in a minute, in 1861, he emancipates the serfs. So he basically gives them their freedom and unties them from the land. And he does, what else have I got? Yeah, he gets lots of literaries and authors and musicians during his period of reign. But there's a lot of little things that go under the rug a little bit under his reign that also are negative. And his son will later say that because of the reforms that his father had implemented, he was weaker. Basically, he made the empire weaker because of the good things that he implemented, and that the assassination attempts and the wars and the riots were caused because of these reforms. Even though they were more positive and they were going to make Russia a more modern society, his son would later go on to say that, well, they actually caused more harm than good. And we're also going to see that Alexander might not be at fault, but nonetheless, the Russian government and the Russian sort of empire at the time were definitely at fault for some of these things. And Russia was weak at the time because of the Crimean War. And I've got written here, even with the fall of serfdom and former serfs, we're still trapped with servitude and poverty. So even though they were untied from the lands where they were serfs, the only skills they know were from being a serf, and they weren't educated, and they had very little travel. They grew up in these communities. Where were they meant to go? This is some new modern ideas where you have to detach yourself from current day environments and realize that it wasn't so easy to be able to say, well, I'm just going to uproot and leave this place and I'm going to go somewhere else and try and get a new life, because it was day-to-day survival rather than yearly survival. And so it's interesting to look into that. But nonetheless, here's some of the stuff that Alexander II would implement during his reign. Is that he created the Zemstva in 1864, which looked after educational and social affairs, which again was trying to push Russia forward into the modern world. Because at that point there was no education, there was no welfare, and since he was going to free the serfs, he hadn't thought, well, actually, I need to give them something in order to make them better. Because as we've stated, that there is there's very little for the serfs to acquaint themselves with. That there's no educational system to go for. They can't reskill, so they just stay as the job they previously had. Except the owners don't want to pay them because they used to be serfs and now they're not. It's very complex. And then while this is all happening in 1863 in Warsaw, which Russia controlled at the time, they had a riot. And it was just open fire massacres going on at the time. So Alexander allowed this to happen under his rule. Now, we don't know whether there was decentralized command and the generals in Warsaw, this was their fault. But we do know that under his rule, there were still massacres, there was still shootings of mass amounts of people. And we see that here. And then also in 1865, Great Britain. So here's a contrary to what most of education is classified by a lot of people as whitewashing, and having the British Empire shown as a great thing. In this case, we've got the opposite side, where there's basically the 19th century version of the Cold War in 1865 between Britain and Russia for Afghanistan. And Britain at the time controls India, the British Indian Empire area there, and then you've also got Russia on the other side of Afghanistan, where they control Kazakhstan, they control Uzbekistan, they control that whole area, and they're looking to take Afghanistan, but they know the British Empire is on the other side, and they've just lost the war with 10 years before for the Crimean War, and they don't want another war there, and they're having constant battles with savage tribes within the Caucasian areas of Europe, and then they've also got the Ottoman Empire that are consistently having wars with. So they don't want another enemy on the line, and it's fascinating to see that during this period of time they think that they can try and take on Afghanistan through bribing the locals, by trying to get the locals to basically be, you've got very similar like in Western East Germany in the 1950s and 60s. You had the Allies on one side, and then you had the Russians on the other. And in this case, I'm talking about the British versus the Russians. And yet the British were just doing as bad as the Russians in this case. They were bribing the locals in Afghanistan. They were trying to get their ways into it. And in the end, it was a bit of a moot point. We don't really see Afghani history or Russian versus Britain, or even Americans in this case, until much later, until the 21st century, where we have Afghanistan, and even in the late 20th century, where we have Afghanistan being invaded by Russia again, the USSR, I should say, but that's skipping forward too much. And let's go back to the 1855 to 1881 period of Alexander II's reign. And so in 1869, you had Leo Tolstoy release War and Peace, which is one of the greatest literary pieces of all time. And I've read snippets of it, and I'm glad to say that I've been lucky enough to read stuff like this and to get an idea. And you also had in the late 19th century, you had Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky. So you had all these people who were creating great pieces of work under Alexander's reign. But we've also got to remember that at the same time, these guys were some of the few educated. They had the ability to read and write, and they were part of only the 10% of Russians who were able to do so at this period of time. And we're slowly trying to educate Russia, and Russia's slowly trying to get its population to become better. And as we've seen, that this higher part of society does produce some absolutely brilliant writers and brilliant authors and brilliant musicians. And so it's quite interesting to see that such a large country can produce, even in the darkest times, some brilliant, bright lights. 1877, another war with the Ottoman Empire, which has the interception of Europe as well. And again, I'm bringing back Britain here because I want to use myself as a sort of a battering ram between the whitewashing that currently constantly gets talked about. Because I'm going to bring you some reality. Britain's not a good empire. That's not true at all. In this case, we see the jealousy of the French, the Germans, the British, of the Russians, basically beating the Ottomans, wanting more land and not getting any of it. And so there's a peace treaty signed between the Ottoman Empire and Russia at the time. And it's done in Europe. And the European intervention basically lessens the sort of punishment for the Ottoman Empire. And as I said earlier, it was a sick child. And so the Ottomans were vulnerable. And for some reason, for many years, they get in as many battles as possible with Russia. And during this period of time, while all this is happening, the emperor is constantly having attempts on his life made. And Alexander II, even though he's making these reforms, it's almost, as his son has put it, as if more people want to kill him because of these reforms. And sadly, he's eventually killed in 1881 by a bomb, which deforms and kills him not immediately, but his carriage is blown up, half his body, he's bleeding. It's awful. There's a whole article that you can look up, a description of what the crowd see, and there's pictures online of the carriage blowing up and body parts being thrown into the air, basically. And even though we get to the end of his reign here, he's still considered a liberator. And I don't know, in Russia, it's one of those countries I really want to visit. I think it would be amazing to see a different culture like that. And I think that it's really intriguing to think about that to this day, is he still a liberator? Is he still considered the good guy? Even though mass murders, wars that weren't given the right amount of land back, serfdom that didn't work, and sort of education system that wasn't there until the last minute. A lot of these questions are out there, and they're questions that, to me, still float over my head. They're still at the back of my mind. There's no answers, but it's interesting, isn't it, nonetheless? And we move on to his son, who I've talked about, mentioned, Alexander III, who rules from 1881 to 1894. And he's a completely different person. Cold, pious, doesn't really show anything that his father has shown before. He sees what his father did as weakness. And he relies on the three values that Russia has placed on before: the church, himself, and then the Russian nationality itself. And we're going to see here these group identity politics come into play, and that they've been around since this time and even before that. And we'll go into it. But Alexander vowed to re-implement autocratic rule. That's really important, because we've got to consider that we've had this little bit where Russians have been given these breadcrumbs of hope from the father beforehand. And before this, they've just had consistent war, and they've had two good leaders. They've had the two greats. They've had Catherine, and then they've had Peter, and that's it. And throughout the period of time, there's been these little pieces, these extra dominoes being laid, and it's as if a match is being flicked in 1855, and they're finally going to see what happens. And so we've got Alexander III, who I feel pushes a firm sort of grip onto Russia, and that grip sort of was loosened by his father, and is gripped so tightly that his son Nicholas II afterwards looks so weak, because his grip is even further down, because he's trying to become even further modernization. It's as if the Russian people are going backwards and then forwards, 2 steps back for every step forward. And so Alexander III implements the Ok which is the secret police. And again, I'm sorry for my pronunciation here. Used to infiltrate the Russian revolutionary groups. And as I've stated before, Russia is vulnerable now to these ideas, these revolutionary ideas. They've been talked about by sort of higher aristocratics, but now they're within the masses. They can be transferred through groups, through riots. They've seen mass murders happen so far because of these ideas, but people still continue them. And those found guilty within these Russian groups are hanged. And we're going to see further down the line that there's actually political people who use this as a way to basically continually make things worse, because the hangings don't solve anything. They just show that these ideas are dangerous. Russian Jews were discriminated against at this time as well. And due to Alexander's Russian nationalist police, they were basically pushing all of the Jews out of the country. Now, because they'd controlled Poland up till this point, a lot of the Jewish people had been absorbed into the Russian land. Catherine the Great had basically given them a sector of land between the old Russia and Poland, and said, you can't enter this area of Russia. This is for purist Russians, but you can stay here within no man's land between Europe and us. So Jews have been discriminated against since day one, and this is put forward even further because within this patch of land they were trapped, and even when they were in the pure Russia later on in time, in this period of time now, they have even greater discrimination. And Alexander III nationalist policy basically causes these things called pogroms, which are where these secret police basically go on raids against the Jewish people. And in 1891, the government expels 20,000 Jews from Moscow, which then, over the next 40 years, causes 2 million Jews to leave Russia, a lot going to the USA and some coming to Britain. And it's interesting here where we see Russia, Russia's the bad guy in this scenario, but we've seen Britain and the USA taking in the Jews, come on in. But what we're really seeing here is this identity politics, is that what the Russian leader has done is said the bigger group, the mass, is everybody who isn't Jewish, basically, in Russia. So anybody who isn't a Jew is therefore a good guy, and therefore you're fine. You can stay here and live here and work. But that's not the case. Even within that group, we can divide the group even further, and we can say, well, you're a serf, you're illiterate, and we can go further and we say you're not an aristocrat, you're even further out of the group. And so it gets worse and worse and worse. And it's these political identities that people assign to people that make things worse for their lives. And as we've seen with the Jews here, they're an extremely good example of discrimination that happens over hundreds of years and is not really solved until the 21st century. And even then, there's still discrimination between anyone. But the communists in this point weren't the first people to do it, because they did use the gulags, they did use the group identity politics of, I think they were called, you had the proper farmers, so you had the Soviets, who were the Workers' Party, the workers' people, and then you went into, is it Kruf? I can't remember off the top of my head. There's a group of people basically who become the enemy, the equivalent of the Jews within the Russian state. And we'll get into that later in another podcast. But it's very interesting to see that even now, within the 19th century, you've still got these people being discriminated against and used as political power to get the government to gain a stronger hold on the land. And so, with that happening, the Franco-Russian alliance happens, basically. So while this is happening, Russia's discriminating against its own people. France and Russia recognize that Germany are a threat, and they say, we want to be friends. Let's be friends so that when a war happens, we fight together and we fight against the Germans. And it's because at the time, Germany is starting to grow as an empire, it's starting to get bigger. France has, over the years, always considered their next door neighbors as enemies. There's been little wars that happen between them, and Russia and France have buried the hatchet when it comes down. Comes down to the war between uh, between Napoleon and them. And so it's very funny to see that old alliances and old enemies, they switch very quickly within this period of time. And within this time, you've also got Witt being assigned as the finance minister and the prime minister within this time period in 1891. And he goes to modernize the Russian economy. And the Trans-Siberian Railway becomes a thing within this period of time. And it's 5,000 kilometers long, going from Moscow all the way up until, I think it's, I can't even pronounce it, but basically on the edge of China and near Japan. And it's fascinating to see that during this period of time, Russia goes from a country that has only had a railway, just the one, in 1851, and then goes on to create one of the biggest railways of all time. It's just like that, because their nation is so big, and they become, as we see later on, one of the biggest, greatest growing economies. And this happens just before the First World War, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And so it's the end of Alexander III's reign, basically. And as I said, he ends his reign as a man of religion, autocracy, and nationality. And he becomes that grip, that war, that sort of typical sort of tyrant. And I think this is the tipping point, basically. Russians are starting to get like, there's a better way out of this. We've seen this. Look at the other countries. They're doing things differently. Why can't we? And we'll see this with Nicholas II. And it's a very big period of time between 1894 and 1917. And so in 1896, it starts off terribly. His coronation is awful. 1,400 people are trampled during the coronation. So you're thinking to yourself, "Oh yes, I've become king," and his coronation doesn't happen until 1896, and people die from it, crushed to death. So many people. So that's not great. And then China grants Russia the right to create a base in Port Arthur in the 1900s, and basically China is trying to basically organize itself at the time, and Russians are like, well, we like this border, we like the Manchurian area, we'd like to help in there, and we like that port. We want more connections to the port because they've only got one port near St. Petersburg. They want another one. They want to have more access to Europe and Asia, and they want to have greater ability to trade. And so you've got to think to yourself, well, why would the Chinese do this? Well, they've got Japan next door. And Japan is starting to become a much more antagonistic and aggressive country at this period of time. They're starting to want more. They're starting to try and expand like the other greater nations. And we see that with their victory over the Russians in 1905, where it's one of the biggest shocks. Huge shock. And that is that Russia, a great nation with hundreds of thousands of men at their disposal, and they lose to little old Japan. Now, it's a humiliating treaty signed. President Roosevelt is there. He's the one who gets Russia and Japan to sign it. And to the Russians, it looks like the Americans have the Japanese side and that the US could have helped them. And to the Japanese, the look at the US as, oh, you could have got us better deal here. We didn't get enough from the Russians, and they feel like they've been hard done by. So it's a lose-lose situation for both countries. And even while this is happening, so while there's a war going on in the sort of far east of Russia, in St. Petersburg, you have the Bloody Sunday, 1905. It's awful. Russian army opens fire on crowds. Hundreds of people dead. Blood everywhere. and therefore known as Bloody Sunday. And so it looks even worse for Nicholas II. So he's just lost a war. He's had people trampled to death. Not him personally, but his coronation was not organised well, and that reflects badly on him. And then he's had people in his capital be massacred. Terrible. So he has to reform. He's forced to. And so there's this sort of, well, he didn't really have a choice. Everything was going to hell. He needed to do something. And so the October Manifesto comes into a new political rights for the people. Free speech is introduced, and an assembly as well. And this leads to the Constitution of 1906. And the Star shares electoral power with the assembly. However, there is a clause within the Constitution that says that at any point the Tsar can say, well, I'm disbanding the assembly. So he still has full control over this period of time. So we're starting to see, again, these little breadcrumbs that Alexander II placed forward. We're starting to see Nicholas have to do it. So it's less like his grandfather, and nothing like his father, and so he's got this awful job of looking like he's forced into this scenario. And then you also get in 1906 is that Witt has lost the Tsar's confidence because of all of this happening, because of what happened in St. Petersburg. He's like, you're no longer my man in the finance and political sector. You're out. And so Nicholas assigns somebody who turns out to be worse for a name. His name is Stolypin. And Stolypin basically takes all the Russian revolution groups, and he's more aggressive. He's even greater than previously before within Alexander III's reign, and he basically hangs people to the point where his nickname, as I've spoken before, it becomes no longer the noose, but Stolypin's necktie. Isn't that great? Stolypin's necktie. The man took the noose, the hangman's noose, and became the very thing that is killing people. Terrible. And that's probably why he was getting assassination attempts multiple times on his life. And so, these hangings, these nicknames, they're fun to look at from now, but at the time it wasn't a term of endearment. It was a term of like, you're killing my people, it's time for you to die. And in 1911, you had Stolypin assassinated. And it's not even within the center of Russia. It's not like it's in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. It's in Kiev. And so it's easy for the government to sort of push it aside because Kiev is further away from the empire. It's more towards the Polish area, the Ukrainian area. And so that's pushed away, and that's forgotten about, believe it or not, because in 1911, at the same time, Rasputin joins as a friend, an advisor within the Romanov family. And it's interesting to see how quickly he ascends to power within the family. Little is known of how this happened. All people know is that he was what you would describe as religious man who was able to deal with the Tsar's son's issues of illness, his illnesses. And it earned him favor within the family. And all while this is happening, in 1913, Russia becomes the fastest growing empire, economic empire in Europe. And so you're thinking to yourself, well, we've had assassination attempts, we've had mass murder, they've lost the war. How are they growing faster than anyone else in Europe? Well, it's because they've had this huge amount of time to grow, and there's all this ground to cover. So while the other empires have already moved away from agriculture and into industry, Russia is still phasing it out. And so you've got to think to yourself, well, this huge jump in economic growth isn't really because they have a great industry. It's because they've had to adapt and they've moved away from agriculture. And so they haven't really done anything special. They've just basically copied what the European countries have done, but they've done it well. And they've done it in a period of time which is unlucky as well, because up to this point, Nicholas could have probably, within the next 10 years, pushed off anything that could have happened. But we all well know what happens next. 1914 to 1917, World War I. Heavy defeats is the first thing written here. Heavy defeats. Think about that for a second. Russia gets into a war because of other people, because of a Slavic state being attacked by the Australian-Hungary Empire. And you think to yourself, well, why should Russia get involved? Well, it's a matter of pride and a lot of the allegiances we've spoken about previously. And so Germany declares war, and therefore France declares war, and therefore, well, Russia has to agree with France because they signed a treaty years ago. So there's a lot of this going on, and Britain has to protect France and Poland, and all of this. And well, Poland doesn't even exist at the moment, but nonetheless, you've got all of these inner states that are at war with one another, and so the Russians get involved, and they want to get involved because there's also the opportunity to be able to gain land. It's constantly trying to expand. We've seen it earlier within the 1800s of trying to expand southern. It's basically chip away at the Ottoman Empire, chip away at the old Mongolian Empire, and chip away at the Afghani region. And now they have a war on their hands. And sadly, Russia are not prepared. They're not prepared. Military effects, they're not prepared within the capitals of the country. There's a shortage of food. And this isn't at the beginning. This is gradually what happens, because the country doesn't realize. A lot of the countries are thinking, oh, we can get this over and done with. This will be over within a year or so. But really, what they've got in their hands is a 4-year war that's going to destroy hundreds of thousands of lives. And it's an intolerable strain on the Russian people. And in 1915, there's a general retreat, and they lose huge amounts of land. And so it looks terrible for the Russian country. Nationally, there's a loss of pride. But in 1916, they win a battle. And you'd think to yourself, well, great, Russia have pushed forward, they gained some land back, and they've not lost the war yet. Well, the problem is that in 1916, they used the Brusilov offensive, and it was the most offensive out of all the Allies. But the problem was that they'd attacked so much that they'd run out of men, they'd run out of ammunition, and they couldn't attack any further. They couldn't take any more land. And so they were in this stagnant position where there was nothing more to do. There were shortages. And so because of this heavy loss, the Russian army is unable to attack any further. And while this is all happening, in 1916, Rasputin is murdered. His influence over the Romanov family is noticed by many aristocratic people, and many believe that the British sent assassins to kill him. And fun sort of facts about, well, I wouldn't say facts, but myths and sort of legends around Rasputin is that it took multiple attempts within one day to kill him. They poisoned him, they stabbed him, they threw him in a river to drown. They did all these things. Apparently, that Rasputin took small amounts of arsenic at breakfast because he was prepared for poisoning. That's a strange man, to say the least. But his influence over the family was done. He was dead. He was gone. And so, 1917, the revolution. There's an intolerable strain, food shortages. The government has lost control of the capital. And the Tsar is told by his government that if he doesn't abdicate, there will be anarchy. And I totally agree. If he hadn't done anything, it could have got worse. But the irony is that what the successful plan they had in mind was to basically give the Tsar position to his brother, Grand Duke Michael. But Michael declines, and so there is a power vacuum. Everything that the Russians have known up to this point has been religion, the Tsar, and their nationality. But they've had nationality stripped apart because of the World War. And the Tsar, he's the one to blame because he's the head of the army. He's the face of the army. The defeats are his defeats. And so he has to be gone. But we need a new leader. And so there's no leader, there's no nationality. All that's left is religion. And the religion, well, there's being a lot more atheists because of the amount of communist and revolutionary ideas being sent into the country. And so there's a loss there. And so the three pillars of Russian government and Russian politics and Russian empire are gone. And so a provisional government seizes that power vacuum, but not for long. The people start to elect their own councils, and these councils are known as Soviets. Yes, this is where we've got to at this point, is that the Russian people are tired of answering to others, and it's time to start blaming those in charge. But it gets worse as long. Lenin and the Bolsheviks plan to seize the capital, and they do. They take the provisional government and they arrest them, and they give them to the people, and they say, "You no longer part of this nation." And in October 1917, Leon Tolstoy helps organize this coup. And from there, we see the one of the worst civil wars, the bloodiest civil wars we'll ever see between the whites and the red communists, the red communists and the white Russians. And so we have a situation here where the sort of period now is that Russia has lost. They have no food. They are a nation broken apart. Their foundations that have been built for 300 years of a dynasty have been thrown away. And it's all, as we've seen, flicked from Alexander II all the way to Nicholas II. And we see the world's first communist state created after the Civil War. But that's for another time. What we have sort of investigated here is that it wasn't just that the people became communist because the Communist Party was the best party to go for at the time. People were slowly in Russia, slowly but surely, through a 300-year dynasty. Again, this is really important because misinformation nowadays is very key, and a lot of people think that we can, these states and empires and governments can fall like within a year, but they can't. It took so long for each of these sort of governments to fall, these political powers. And as we've sort of gone over here, there's this sort of slow but sure gradual grinding away at the Russian people. And no wonder ideas are thrown away. Basically, they're told any new idea, any liberal idea, is you'll be put to death for by two leaders. And then they even have the liberator, even their own liberator, mass murders, mass killings. And so there's not one person to blame here. Every single leader between 1855 up till 1917, and every single government slowly but surely makes mistakes. And these mistakes slowly but surely cause Lenin and the communists to take power and cause one of the worst periods of history for the Russians ever. And I think I'll explore that in another podcast, and we'll go over 1917 all the way up until when the wall falls in Germany. And I'm pretty sure that's just before I was born in 1994, 1991, something around that period of time. It's probably 1989 now, but whatever. I'll get my history correct later on. But fascinating history period, fascinating time. I'll leave you on this. The question that lingers in my mind right now is, if World War I didn't happen, do you think that Nicholas II would still be the Tsar? Would there still be Tsars in Russia? It's interesting to think, isn't it? Anyway, fantastic, interesting. I've loved this. I hope you have. This has been a Taylor's Tales podcast. This is Chris's Corner. I'm your host, Chris Taylor. And as always, I hope to see you next week.